Hi, Charles SirBookSage here. Welcome to another Sunday night live stream. Tonight is going to be Fixing the MCU Part 2, where I'm going to go over how to do a soft reboot of the MCU. Last week I did what turns out to be a Part 1. It wasn't originally meant to be a Part 1, but I did how I would introduce the Fantastic Four and the X-Men into the MCU timeline. And so you can find that, you'll find that live stream later on in the cards, and you'll find it in the show notes later. But today I want to do a part 2 of that, where I want to go over specifically how to reboot the MCU, and in this case do a soft reboot. And it doesn't change anything I talked about last week in terms of how I would introduce the Fantastic Four and the X-Men. The only change would be to when they'd come into the story. They're just going to, with this soft reboot, they'd come in earlier than they would come in otherwise. So today's kind of going to be a fun little sort of, if you're a Doctor Who fan, it's going to be a very Timey Wimey one, where I'm going to play around and have a little fun. And people are probably going to completely disagree with my premise here. But that's the fun part of having these sort of less tinkering with story worlds and stuff, is to see what you would do to fix things that are going wrong. So, before I get started, hi, I'm Charles. Welcome to my SirBookSage YouTube channel. I talk about science fiction and fantasy here. A lot of that is sometimes book related, because I'm usually reading some big sci-fi or fantasy series. Currently reading Malazan, almost done with it. Cosmere will be up next. I'm doing a reread of Dune starting next year, because I've never finished the last two, like I think Heretics and Chapter House. So I want to finally read those final two books. I've read the first 4 many times. So, but today we are talking Marvel, and in particular, going over how I would fix the MCU. And I'm going over specifically how to do a soft reboot. Now, my personal preference would be for Disney Marvel to just finish this whole multi-arc. Hey, B&B Books, how you doing? My personal choice would be to just do a full reboot of the universe, like take the multiverse and just build to some cataclysmic event and reboot the whole thing. Doctor Who did it at the end of Series 5. The Pandorica opens, the Big Bang two-parter, where the 11th Doctor reboots the universe. So it's something that can be done, and can be done very well. And yeah, I have my live stream up over here, so I can actually see that I'm live. So it's sort of Inception in my TV. But it can be done. Now, that's what I would prefer to do. That would, however, require Disney to admit they failed, which is something I don't see a company like Disney wanting to do. So what I'm going to present today is how to do a soft reboot organically in story with what already exists. And this is just going to be kind of a fun exercise in playing around with timelines and multiverses and stuff. So I'm going to set the scene. I'm going to take you back to the first Avengers movie. And in particular, the Chitauri have been defeated. Natasha has closed the portal. Hulk has caught the unconscious falling Iron Man. And Tony's woken up and he wants to get shawarma. But they have to deal with Loki first. And then the movie cuts to Loki up in the penthouse at this point, where he's still on the floor after having been trounced around by Hulk earlier, you know, the puny god. And he then looks up, and we get from his POV, we see that sort of iconic shot of the Avengers all standing around looking down at him. I think Hawkeye even has an arrow knocked. And Loki says, if it's all the same to you, I'll have that drink now. And hi, Jeremiah. Focus on X-Men would be nice. That was actually my live stream last Sunday. I actually went over how I would introduce the Fantastic Four and the X-Men. I went over how I'd bring all of them into the MCU in my live stream last week. So you'll find, I'll add that to the show notes after this. So if you didn't catch that, you can go watch that, because I did a whole live stream on just that last week. So Loki, we have that scene where Loki says, I think I'll have that drink now. Now, in the Avengers movie, we have a jump cut right there to the Avengers are now outside, down on the street level. Loki's in handcuffs. They're handing the Tesseract off to S.H.I.E.L.D. agents, and Thor calls the Bifrost and takes Loki up to Asgard to be imprisoned. And then we see we see Fury talking to the council. He's upstairs talking to the council in the S.H.I.E.L.D. building. And they're not happy that he's just letting the Avengers go about their business. But, it is what it is. And that's kind of how the first Avengers movie wraps up. Now, Endgame makes that last scene after the jump cut not really possible. Because in Endgame, the Endgame Avengers come back through time using the quantum tunnel back to this Battle of New York. And they're in Stark Tower while the original Avengers are going up to the penthouse to basically arrest Loki. So now we see Endgame Tony, and it's Tony, Cap, Ant-Man, and Thor, and Hulk are the ones who come back to New York here. Hulk's job is to go talk to the Ancient One to get the Time Stone from her. And Thor goes to Asgard. It's Tony, Steve, and Ant-Man and Hulk are here from Endgame back. Hulk goes to the Ancient One to try to get the Time Stone off of her, and Tony, Ant-Man, and Cap are coming back to the Stark building. Tony and Ant-Man need to get the Tesseract, and Cap's job is to get the Scepter, because both have Time Stones. Have Infinity Stones in them. So we see Endgame Tony fly in to the penthouse, sort of in the back, change into his regular clothes kind of thing with the nanotech. And he's watching. Ant-Man is shrunk next with him. And he's watching, and he sees Loki say, "I'll have that drink now." And he sees the original Timeline Avengers gathered around him. And then Sitwell comes in with the strike team that's usually with Cap, who all turn out to be Hydra agents later, right? They come in, and Natasha hands them the scepter, and her and Clinton are just hanging at Tony's bar having a drink. And they put the scepter in that big case, and Sitwell and that strike team leave with the scepter. And Avengers Tony, has the Tesseract, puts it in his briefcase. And Avengers Tony and Thor, with Loki in custody, they go with some S.H.I.E.L.D. agents and tactical gear into the elevator. And they tell Thor, Hulk, take the stairs, because this is, again, original Timeline Endgame, Avengers Hulk. They tell him to take the stairs, because Endgame Hulk is talking to the Ancient One, uptown or downtown. So they're coming down the elevator, original Timeline Tony, Thor with original Timeline Loki. Original Timeline Hulk is coming down the stairs, and now Endgame Tony is now flown down to the lobby. He's now dressed in tactical gear himself, so no one notices him. And we have original Tony, Thor with Loki, come out of the elevator, they're coming through the lobby, and they're confronted by Alexander Pierce and his people. And there's a standoff. Pierce wants the Tesseract, and he wants Loki. And they're grabbing Tony, and Endgame Tony has Ant-Man give original Timeline Avengers Tony almost like a mini heart. It's not a heart attack, but it's close to it. So he drops down. Ant-Man pushes the case over to Endgame Tony. Tony grabs it, and before he could escape, Hulk, original Timeline Hulk, comes smashing out of the staircase, knocks Endgame Tony on his ass. The Tesseract bounces out of the case, slides over to original Timeline Loki, who grabs the Tesseract and escapes. Okay? And this is the Loki, original Timeline Loki we're following now in the Loki TV show. So, right after this, we cut to Endgame Cap gets in the other elevator where Sitwell and the strike team have the scepter. And he convinces them, he does Hail Hydra, and they give him the scepter. So they assume he's now one of them. And then he's confronted by original Timeline Avengers Captain America on the 14th floor, I think it is. And they fight, and Endgame Cap incapacitates original Timeline Cap. So, and we have no idea, I don't know where Natasha and Clint, they're probably still upstairs finishing their drink, for all we know. We don't see them in Endgame, where they go from here. And then, of course, Endgame Tony and Ant-Man are outside. Endgame Cap comes out with the scepter, gives the scepter to Ant-Man, and Tony and Steve realize they can go back to 1970 to get the Tesseract from the military base where Steve was given the super soldier serum in the past. because the Tesseracts and more Pym particles are there in 1970. So they jump to that, and Ant-Man jumps back to the Endgame timeline. Okay, so here's where the soft reboot comes in. What does Captain America, original timeline Captain America, do when he wakes up? Because remember, the original Cap has been incapacitated by the scepter. So he's still lying on the 14th floor. What does he do when he gets up? I imagine original timeline Tony might have just had a heart attack, so he's going to go to his lab and get the arc reactor checked out. So I imagine Thor and Bruce will go with him. Natasha is probably, and Clint are probably finishing their drink upstairs. So they're going to hear all this commotion and come probably looking for Cap. And so the question is, what do? We never get to see what Captain America does when he wakes up. Because remember, at the end of Avengers, Fury's having a conversation with the Council, and they're not happy. That conversation is now going to be a very different conversation here, because Loki and the Tesseract are gone. So, good chance that the Council probably fires Fury, just removes him as director. Because remember, Malik is on the Council, and you have Alexander Pierce, two high-ranking Hydra people. So they could take this opportunity to basically fire Fury, and replace him with a Hydra member as the new director. And that Hydra member will then replace all the department heads with Hydra. So Hydra won't even need to carry out the violent coup we see in Winter Soldier. They can just take over Hydra here, because they can use Loki escaping to just get Fury out of the way. And now Fury, I imagine they would probably want to basically detain him and detain the Avengers. And now, Fury probably has 7 or 8 different ways to get out of that building, and a contingency plan for every scenario where he needs to get out of there. So Fury's getting out of that building. That strike team's not detaining him. So you could have in the actual what really happened that we never got to see, because, again, Loki never made it out of the building in this original version of these characters. So that jump cut after, I think, I'll have that drink now, we've jump cut into a parallel universe there. And we've been in a multiverse ever since that jump cut in the first Avengers movie at the end. And we've been in that specific parallel universe from that jump cut, after I'll have that drink, all the way until Loki grabs the Tesseract, escapes. Tony and Steve go further back in time. Ant-Man goes back to the original Endgame timeline, because right after, as that's happening, the TVA show up and arrest Loki, and then set off the time bomb and wipe that whole instance the multiverse out. They wiped this whole timeline we've been following from that jump cut here to here. Now, you might say, well, no, Loki creates this branch as soon as he grabs the Tesseract, so it's a brand new branch. True, but the whole past has happened already. The multiverse, when it's created, does not have a past. So in this multiverse instance that Loki creates when he grabs the Tesseract, it creates this time loop. Because Loki never makes it outside, so when we see him outside in the first Avengers movie, it has to be a parallel universe now, because this is the original Loki from the original movies that jumps off, it escapes. That's who we're following. So the Cap knocked out has to be original timeline Cap. And he's going to wake up. So we have Fury is probably going to be fired, and he's going to take off because he can see where this is headed. Natasha and Cap might have to go on the run with Fury, because they're going to have to fight their way out of this building now. And Tony's got 10,000 lawyers who could keep them tied up in court with anything they try to do to him. And Loki's a god. Thor's a god, so they really can't do much to him. And if there's one thing Bruce Banner knows how to do, it's run. He can turn back into Hulk at any point and just leap out of there and go back down into the jungles in South America, and they'll never find him again. So you create this really interesting dynamic. So the way to soft reboot the MCU is they bring us back to Cap waking up after that fight, because he thinks it was Loki he was fighting. And we see what happens. What's the fate of this original timeline version of these characters from that moment? We never get to see that. So in that original timeline, for all we know, Natasha's still alive, Tony's still alive, because that timeline might not ever go towards the Infinity War. We can have completely different things happening here. So you bring us back to that moment, recast all the Avengers for this returning back to this moment. So now you've got a younger cast. You have a whole brand new phase 2 you can do, phase 3, phase 4. And what you've done is you now split this. You have now the Variantverse, which is what we've been following since the end of the first Avengers movie. This is now all Variantverse stuff. And we now have original timeline, and we're back to the end of phase 1 with original timeline. And where I talked last week about doing the Fantastic Four as a period piece, like they did the first Captain America movie, do the Fantastic Four period piece in the 60s, and then have some event at the end of that, like cosmic tear in time and space, suck them out of the 60s and drop them here in the main timeline. So circling back to that from last week's live stream, instead of them dropping them in phase 7 or 8 or wherever Marvel's going to have them now, you drop them here at the end of phase 1. So you can have the Fantastic Four in the main timeline, like right at the end of phase 1. So phase 2 can start with the Fantastic Four now being here. And I would have whatever this time rift is that you can use to suck them forward. So you can have the period piece and then have them in the main timeline after. Very similar to what worked with Captain America in the original phase 1. You have whatever that is, or whoever is doing that, you can have that be what starts waking up the X gene, which then starts explaining why mutants would suddenly start showing up in phase 2. So then you might have, when they're sucked out of time originally, you might have that be what wakes up Xavier's gene and Magneto's gene from their timeline, and they've kind of been doing their own thing, looking and seeing who they could find. So now when this happens again on this end of it, it's now waking up the X gene in modern day. So this is why Xavier would be ready to move and find Scott when his X gene triggers and his powers come. And because remember, Storm at this point here at the end of phase 1 should be in Cairo. She's a master thief in the streets of Cairo at this point. And so you can have her kind of powers emerging there. So you'll have Xavier. Phase 2, you have what I talked about last week, where Scott gets his own movie, Storm gets her own movie, Wolverine gets his own movie, and then you introduce the other X-Men who are going to be X-Men as supporting characters in their individual films. And then phase 2 builds towards some event that ends up forming the X-Men. And if we have Tony basically lured up over here, Thor is in Asgard because he doesn't want to deal with the mess that they don't even know how it happened. Bruce is on the run down who knows where. Cap and Natasha and Fury are kind of on the run on their own thing. You can have some bigger event that ends up pulling all these people back where they're going to need Cap, they're going to need Natasha, they're going to need Fury. And one of the things you can really have fun with here is there's no way to recanonize Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. You can't do it. You can canonize Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. to this Variantverse that gets created here if you circle back to the original timeline and continue from there. Because Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. Season 1 ties directly into Captain America Winter Soldier. So there, you can be canon to that, because the later Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. seasons get into all multiverse, timeline, dimensional travel, and everything, so it fits into that Variantverse. And once you make that the Variantverse, everything they're now currently doing with Thor Love and Thunder and the Marvels, there's no handcuffs anymore. They can just have complete fun with that, since it's now a Variantverse, and they can do whatever the hell they want there. And now, because you're back to the original timeline and continuing and seeing what really happened to this original group before the timelines got messed up. And so you can't do Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., but you can canonize the individual Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. characters if you do this soft reboot. Melinda May is writing a desk in S.H.I.E.L.D. She might be, whether it's the Triskelion, so she's going to be there, and she's going to be seeing this new director, bringing in these new people, and she's going to start noticing there's problems. Mac is there somewhere as well, working in S.H.I.E.L.D. And if you have Stark Enterprises, like their R&D stuff is ramping up, and you do have the Fantastic Four have dropped out of a rift in time, and the Baxter Building is going to be up and running, one of these two people they're going to be recruiting Fitz and Simmons. So you're going to have, maybe Fitz will go to Stark Industries, maybe Simmons will go to Baxter, who knows? But you can introduce each of the individual Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. as well. And if Fury's on the run, and with Natasha and the Cap, though they might not all be together, and Fury needs Natasha's help because Natasha's, can hack and all that stuff, but she can't get out equipment. She can direct him to a certain sky with Rising Tide, and they could kind of recruit her because she's got all the equipment and everything. So there's ways to introduce all of the individual Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. characters, and then as you build in this new phase 2, you build towards some big whatever event's going to then have Xavier really speed up forming the X-Men from these individual mutants, have the Fantastic Four start getting involved in like what Tony's doing, what S.H.I.E.L.D. is doing, and start bringing these teams together, these super powered teams. The people who are working for them are going to start being pulled together as well. So you'd have Melinda over here, and Mac over there, and Fitz over here, and Simmons, and Skye, and Fury, and something's just going to organically. So you can organically recreate a version of that Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. team in phase 2 or 3 of this sort of soft reboot. So you get street level stuff because you can now bring in Daredevil and Jessica Jones and all that. So you end up with street level. You end up with global threats where you have Avengers, you have X-Men, you have Fantastic Four. And because you have the X-Men in, like I mentioned last week, you bring in the Corsair and his Starjammers. These are sort of the space pirates that have a connection to Scott Summers in particular. And so now you have on your cosmic level, you have Captain Marvel, you have Guardians stuff going on, and you have Starjammer stuff going on. And so they can coordinate a much more focused, like phase 2, 3, 4. They can go forward, like with all 3 layers in place, intact, and really kind of work all different kinds of stories. You can get personal stuff, like what you get with Charlie Cox, with as Matt Murdock. You can get what he brings to that character on those really intense, personal, like street level stuff. Plus, you can have fun with all of that. Like, I would love to see Jessica Jones somehow end up on with like one of the Guardians of the Galaxy. I could just imagine her commentary, the way she is, being on a starship and having to deal with like these crazy people. So, because one of my favorite parts of the Netflix Defenders was particularly Jessica and Matt's like back and forth, their wit with each other. They had a really good chemistry as 2 characters, kind of taking jabs at each other in a friendly way. So there's a lot of things you can do with this soft reboot. And again, it doesn't erase anything that's happened, but it just makes all that stuff variant verse. And then you can have Deadpool show up and just wreak havoc in that. And you also do have Loki with the TVA, who is your bridge between this whole variant-verse, multiverse timelines, and now this soft rebooted original timeline where we're seeing what happened to these original people we started with before that stuff started getting crazy with time. And so you really can have a lot of fun. Now, what I personally would do, which Disney Marvel is never going to do, if I've got all these things in place, I'm doing Claremont X-Men, and I'm doing John Byrne Fantastic Four, and I'm doing Walt Simonson Thor, Mighty Thor stuff. I mean, how we've had 4 Thor films and we haven't had Beta Ray Bill is just unforgivable. As someone who's been a fan of this stuff going way back since I was a kid, how do you get 4 Thor movies and no Beta Ray Bill? So in this sort of soft reboot, you basically go down that Simonson route with Thor. And then there's so many great stories there. And a lot of this stuff is all happening around the same time back in the 80s in the comic books. So you have these bigger integrated stories with each of these components that you can pick from. So you get a coherent, larger picture. And it's amazing that Marvel, before Disney came in, managed to somehow, even though they were piecemealing it together as they went, apparently, get us through those first 3 phases, from Iron Man all the way through Endgame. Now, I am at some point going to do an entire live stream on Endgame, where that movie deserves to be just ripped into a million shreds and eviscerated. because there's so many issues I have with that film. One little minor thing. In Endgame, when they're taking these Infinity Stones from all these different places, they have to bring them all back. Now remember, Steve is the one who brings them all back at the very end. Which means, when you're rewatching Endgame again, when Bruce is talking to the Ancient One, and they're arguing about what happens when you take the Infinity Stone away, it creates the branch, and he's like, yes, but you can erase it by you bring the stone right back to where you took it from. So it's like the stone never left in that timeline. So now think about this. So that means when she gives the time stone to Bruce, right? She puts him back in his Hulk body and gives him the time stone. The second he bounces out of there with the quantum particles, that means Bruce leaves and boom, Captain America is right there. A second later, giving her the stone back. We never see that in Endgame, but that's what has to happen in that scene. We just don't see it. So she's going to know in half a second that they were successful, because the stone has to be returned from the moment it was taken. Which also means, if you really think about it, when we're on that planet and Natasha and Clint are fighting each other to see which one gets to sacrifice themselves so the other can get the stone, that means Steve Rogers is standing in the shadows waiting for these two to finish this so one of them can die, take the stone, and leave so that he can then come out and throw that same stone back over that cliff. So the end of Endgame, Steve Rogers is probably hanging out with Red Skull, having a catch-up chat, waiting as Natasha and Clint are fighting each other. Because he's got to put that stone right back as soon as they leave with it. He's got to put it back right away, so they don't disrupt the times and create all this stuff. So, now, how Steve on his own gets to all these different places, I don't really know. They don't really bother to tell us how the hell Steve gets to that world, or how he gets back into any of the other places they took them from, which also means when Steve and Tony are back in 1970, when Tony steals the Tesseract from that case, puts it in his briefcase, and then Howard Stark shows up, and he has a conversation with his dad, and as they're walking away, there has to be another Steve, separate from the Endgame Steve. So there's a second Steve running around behind both of them, putting back the stuff that each of them take. We just never see it in the movie, but it's implied that that's what has to be happening here. So, just something I wanted to bring up while I was kind of going through how all this stuff works and is connected, because I never really realized until this time around when I was going back through and watching these scenes that, wait, there's got to be a second Steve here in each one of these scenes where they're stealing Infinity Stones. Steve's got to be lurking somewhere to just pop up and put it back, and then bounce out of there on his way to returning the next stone. So, just something to think about. So, Endgame, like I said, I can do an entire live stream just ripping that movie to shreds, because it does so many things wrong. As much as there are things in it that I love, there are things in it that I just can't. I have a big problem with. But so anyway, so this is kind of what's been running in my head since last week, since I went over how to bring in the Fantastic Four and the X-Men, of just kind of running through this soft reboot process. Because, and if you really think about it, the Avengers kind of create what's really an endless loop, creating an infinite amount of parallel universes over and over and over and over and over again. They're sort of caught. The only way to stop that is the TVA would ultimately have to take Loki and put him back in Avengers custody in that first movie. That's the only possible way the scene in the actual Avengers film happens, where we can do the jump cut from I'll have that drink to they're all outside on the street with Loki in custody. The only way that is ever going to be able to happen in the original timeline is if the TVA takes Loki and they all put him back in Avengers custody right at the moment he escapes with the Tesseract. But that can't happen either, because the Endgame Avengers are there, and they would just then steal the Tesseract again themselves or try to steal it. So Loki escaping is what causes Steve and Tony to go back further, so Tony can meet his father. They grab the Tesseract from there, grab more Pym particles. So this would prevent all of that from happening. Now, you could say maybe that doesn't need to happen. If this happens here, they can just get the Tesseract from here. So maybe, so they're still changing timelines and causing weird things to happen. And now, why all that's okay? Why they can jump all over time and just mess everything up and change everything and set things back, and Loki can't do one thing without getting arrested? I've never gotten a real legitimate explanation that satisfies me as to why he's the only one who can't do that. But, and this is something that Back to the Future also, did very well in particularly the second movie. So this Endgame was a little Back to the Future-y in that they were watching themselves, things play out. And this is what was so great about Back to the Future 2, is you have Back to the Future 1 kind of playing in the background of Back to the Future 2, and in the scene you have the first Avengers movie playing in the background of this Endgame movie. So that stuff's a lot of fun. But one does disrupt the other. And and I know they make the argument that what's in Back to the Future is garbage because it changes the timeline, which means Marty's really jumped to a parallel universe. But there's no way to not change the timeline because the Endgame Avengers literally changed the timeline by preventing what happens in the first Avengers movie to happen by Loki escaping. They caused that. So they've changed their own time and created multiverses and all this stuff. So I don't like the explanation that they give that what happens over there, because to me the same thing happens here that happens in Back to the Future. It's the same thing, at least from my point of view. You get the same exact thing happening. They change the past, which changes the future. Except we're jumping through different timelines now. So I don't know. It's like I said, it's all timey-wimey stuff, to use the Doctor Who phrase. And I would prefer if they just rebooted the entire universe. Just have a cataclysmic event cause the whole thing to reboot. I'd have, you can have Galactus show up and have Galactus reboot the whole universe. And because apparently we're going to be getting Galactus, and from what I've heard, Galactus is going to be Hispanic, which seems a bit weird since the character predates the existence of the Marvel Universe, because there was a origin comic for Galactus back in the late 80s, I think. And he exists prior to the universe. He comes from whatever existed before it. And then when this universe is created, he comes into it. And he's been around ever since. So I'm guessing they're just casting whether it's Antonio Banderas or somebody to be Galactus, but I can't imagine he's meant to be an Hispanic Galactus, because that wouldn't make any sense. It'd be just as weird if he was an Irish Galactus. I mean, there were no Irish in the previous universe that pre-existed ours, so we'll see. Casting is the biggest thing I'm worried about going forward, to be honest. So I would have to trust that they could recast these younger Avengers here to soft reboot at the end of Phase 1. But we'll see. I think it can be done. It just opens up so many different possibilities. And see, if you think about it also, DC has the DCU, which was the Snyderverse and is now going to be the Gunverse. But they also have this sort of secondary playground where you have Joaquin Phoenix's Joker, which is getting its sequel. And I think Matt Reeves' The Batman, was starring Robert Pattinson. And that's, I think, getting a sequel as well, from what I've heard. So they have two separate sort of story worlds that they're playing around in. So by bringing us back to showing us what happens when original Timeline Cap wakes up after having been knocked out by Endgame Cap, and then moving forward from there, it lets Marvel have these two playgrounds now. And really opens up a whole host of possibilities. And lets them be a lot smarter about coordinating the Disney Plus TV shows with the movies. Because I know they're trying to coordinate the two of them with what they're doing now. And if they soft reboot it, they can sort of build this all out much better and much smarter. Because I think we finally got an end scene. Was it in Thor: Love and Thunder that had an end scene for the Loki season 2? And I think that's the first time they've done cross-promotion in these end scenes. But that's something they should have been doing from the moment we had WandaVision. The TV show's season finale should, as one of their like mid-credit or end-credit scene, be teasing the next film. And the next film should have as either its mid or end post-credit scene be teasing the next show, whatever the next chapter is in the overarching story, be it movie or TV. That's what should be one of the or the mid or post-credit scenes. It doesn't matter. The movie shouldn't just show movie stuff coming up, and they should be cross-referencing each other. They should have been doing that from the beginning. As soon as the first WandaVision came out, they should have started cross-referencing each other right away. So a weird promotional miss too, if they especially want these to not be two separate audiences of any kind. So, but it would allow them to coordinate all this stuff much better. And the Netflix shows probably become canon to the Variantverse. If you're bringing in the Fantastic Four and the X-Men, now at the end of Phase 1, when this soft reboot, the Netflix shows don't really fit there because the Fantastic Four are going to be in New York City. So to not have any reference of them suddenly in a bunch of seasons of Daredevil and Jessica Jones wouldn't fit. So those would probably, like I say, be Variantverse canon, along with Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., Variantverse canon. But it lets you start over and with Daredevil. So, but it brings Daredevil in where they originally brought him in over Netflix right at the end of this Battle of New York. So this soft boot puts Daredevil back in the right spot to begin his story, rather than whenever they're going to eventually be able to get around to bringing Daredevils, like Born Again or whatever it's going to be. From what I've heard, they've scrapped that whole plot and they're starting over, which is very good if they're going to be starting over. So I hope so, because it's about time that... Sorry. Just checking. There's like a... StreamYard is giving me some like little weird like signal thing. Just making sure I'm not frozen over there. It's... now I lost my train of thought. Trying to think of what I was just saying. Hold on. So, yep, on whatever I was just in the middle of talking about just went out of my mind. But it does let you like reintroduce. Oh yes, that's right. They were scrapping the whatever they were doing for Daredevil. And I think they filmed a bunch of it before the strike. But it sounds like they're trying to like regroup and go in a little different direction. How that's going to work, I don't know. Personally, I would just wipe the slate clean. I'd say we've got this up to this point, and then we're going to continue forward with what we have, but let's just rewrite it all and make it better. But so whether they're going to do even that, I don't know. But there's just right now everything's a mess. I mean, Thor: Love and Thunder, I was shocked at how bad that movie was. That's the very first MCU film that I watched that gave me not one single thing to ever need to come back and rewatch it. And that was something I never expected. Like, I've mentioned this before, like even Multiverse of Madness, Doctor Strange, Multiverse of Madness, that's a chaotic mess of a film. But there's a whole hell of a lot there I enjoy, so I rewatched that. But Love and Thunder, I don't see the need to ever put that movie on ever again. Same with Quantumania. I mean, I was shocked at how horrible that movie was. Some visuals were really good. Some of that CGI was just god-awful. But again, there wasn't really anything in that movie that would cause me to rewatch it. And to put that in perspective, I'm in the Brie Larson was miscast as Carol Danvers crowd. I just think she was a poor choice for the role, personally. But I rewatch the Captain Marvel movie all the time, because there's a whole hell of a lot in it that I enjoy. And quite frankly, after seeing these last few movies, I'm less bothered by how miscast I think Brie Larson is in the role, because it doesn't bother me as much because those couple of recent movies are so bad, so horrible. that it makes stuff that didn't really like earlier, I dislike it a little less, just in comparison. Now, yes, I usually, when I go back to Captain Marvel, I usually fast forward to when she falls through and crashes into the blockbuster, and I'll watch the rest of the movie from there, because that's the whole part of the movie that interests me. The whole opening is just takes too long to get there for me, so there's not much in that opening that I'm interested in rewatching. I'll rewatch it occasionally, but for most of the part, I'll return to the crashing to the blockbuster, and I'll watch the rest, because that I enjoy all of that. But yeah, so I'm trying to think of what else I might need to say about like doing this soft reboot. I just think it would be a lot of fun, because I honestly am curious. I want to know what happened to that Captain America when he wakes up after that fight, and I want to know what happens to Fury, because the Council is not going to tolerate Loki escaping with the Tesseract attack. Because remember, Pierce in that scene in Endgame says, I want that back. That Tesseract that's been in our custody for 70 years. You can't have it. So, and considering Hydra is the one who wants to get their hands on the scepter and that Tesseract, they're not going to be happy. Malik is going to make sure that Fury is fired as director, and then, like I said, that'll kick in a whole new storyline. And again, you recast all these people. As much as I love all the actors in it, they're aging out of these roles. You wouldn't be able to come back to the end of Phase 1 with these same actors. Now, I would bring back Scarlett Johansson and Chris Evans and Robert Downey Jr. if they do the full cataclysmic reboot the entire universe at the end of the multiverse saga. If they're going to do that, I'd bring all these actors back for that whole finale, because that would be a lot of fun. But if you do the soft reboot, I would recast all of them. The only ones that do not get recast ever is Charlie Cox as Daredevil, Kristen Ritter as Jessica Jones. Those two, yeah, you can't recast them. And I'm very partial to all the Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. actors. If you're going to have any of those characters, and you have to have those actors. I can't have anyone else play Fitz and Simmons except for those two, for example. So, but pretty much everyone else, you can recast all of them. And it'd be very interesting to see Yelena, Florence Pugh, Yelena acting off of a different actress playing Natasha. Because I actually liked the interaction between Scarlett Johansson and Florence Pugh in Black Widow. For all the faults the movie might have, their performance and chemistry together was really, really interesting. And if you want to watch a contrast in acting styles, that's a really good movie to watch. In particular, I know I'm going off on tangents here, but in particular, in Black Widow, when it's at night and they're sitting at that picnic table outside, they each have a beer. This is after they've escaped Taskmaster and that whole initial thing. And they're having this conversation, and this is where they decide to try to find the Red Room and take down the Red Room. And what I love is the contrasting acting styles between Florence Pugh and Scarlett Johansson. And if you go back and watch that scene in particular, Florence Pugh is doing what I think Brie Larson is trying to do in Captain Marvel with Carol Danvers, where Florence Pugh can just kind of set her face and get this look, and the look stays in place. But she has just these subtleties as an actress, where it's how she positions her, tilts her head, or just moves the chin ever so slightly, and just has it all in her eyes. So she's able to get across a dynamic performance with having a very stoic looking face. Whereas Brie Larson, she sets that stoic look and it's like a wall. And I don't get much back from her. But Florence Pugh it gives you a masterclass in how to have that sort of stoic face, but give you a whole range of emotions. You know what she's thinking and feeling, even though her face isn't changing all that much. And then you have Scarlett Johansson, where her character, the way Scarlett plays her, Natasha's all taking in information. all around her constantly. She's evaluating and reassessing everything happening around her. It's just her nature in her role and how she's grown up. And so she has all these little micro movements as she's talking. So you watch her face, it's super filled with expression and all these just subtle little movements all the time. She's never really still. And it's just really fascinating to watch these two actresses play off each other in this scene, playing these sisters who aren't sisters kind of thing. And they're very different contrasting styles. It brings their characters alive because they're able to do so much with just subtle little things. Natasha's, though, as Scarlett Johansson, she's always, her face, it's always moving. And because she's always calculating and recalculating and reassessing stuff. And Yelena's very much, she's the assassin where she's locked into her target and she's driven and she's going forward. So you see this in how they act, the characters, and the way they portray and carry themselves. So that's the kind of stuff that is missing right now from Marvel. You're not getting a lot of that. Because even with people, there are people who tear the Black Widow plot apart. And they have some valid points and some things I disagree with, but the acting out of these two in particular, I really, really love. It's my favorite thing about the movie is watching them play off each other and just the different styles of acting between the two actresses. And you're not getting as much of that in these newer movies, and you had some of that in the Black Panther Wakanda Forever movie, because you get Angela Bassett. That woman can act her ass off. She can out-act anybody around her in a scene. So you get some great acting in that film. I do not recognize Namor as Namor. That is just, I hate everything they did there. I mean, if they didn't have the rights to do Namor properly, which they still don't, because Namor, Submariner's rights are very complicated, I believe. I would rather them just have not done him. They should have just created that as a brand new underwater society, and then they could enter the picture as a rival to the Atlanteans. You can even bring them into the comics. They would have been a really interesting new creation, but to try to pass that off as Namor and his people is just... Ugh. So it drags down the Wakanda Forever movie because you have this mess of what they're trying to do with Namor in there. So, but, so I don't really know where they go from here, to be honest. I don't know what their plans is. The strike has sort of derailed so much. It does give them an opportunity to kind of reassess and kind of make some changes going forward. But, because I don't know where they even are in their schedule at this point. I don't know because some of the things that they started, they're scrapping and redoing, so we'll see. But I think my soft reboot idea would kind of reinvigorate and revitalize the MCU, because it would bring us back to the core characters earlier in their timeline before everything gets crazy. And you don't have to do the Infinity Saga. You don't have to have the snap and the train wreck to their whole plots that have come as a result of that 5-year gap, because they haven't really known what to do with that. We had some stuff at the beginning, like right after it, but there's so many things they're just pretending, there'd be no societal impacts from that. I mean, again, we have a petrified celestial sticking up out of the ocean, and it's barely been mentioned ever since Eternals. I think there was one mention of it in something. But yeah, that's kind of a big deal. And I think that would be like the focus of these people in power. Because who has ownership of that thing? Who's claimed it? Who's like pirating it? Who's going in there and kind of getting material from it and what's in that material and all this stuff? So yeah, but even the Sokovia Accords, which was the centerpiece of Captain America Civil War. It ripped the Avengers apart. Their disagreement over the Sokovia Accords. Even that is like just discarded. A throwaway line in the She-Hulk TV show. The Sokovia Accords have been rescinded. Okay, then, if you're... if you're doing Marvel MCU lawyer TV show where it's a superhero lawyer who would be representing other superheroes as they deal with the legal ramifications of the Sokovia Accords. The Sokovia Accords should be front and center into whatever stories you're writing here. Because isn't that the whole point of why you would have She-Hulk come in as a lawyer at this point? Because you now are introducing all the legal ramifications that we started seeing in Captain America Civil War. Because that whole thing, how do you go from that being the centerpiece of your plot, ripping the Avengers to shreds where they almost kill each other, and then, forget all about that. And to not only do that, to discard it so casually, but to discard it in your She-Hulk show where that should be what the show is about. Again, these are the just bizarre choices this people running this stuff today are doing. And these are unforced errors that, separate from what you might think of like some plots and stuff, like that's like, how do you take something that's so significant and not like give it its due? Because if you want them to go away, okay, you need to have a story that builds up to why the world would suddenly decide, oh yeah, that was a mistake to have those Sokovia Accords. Let's do away with those. We need you guys to do this stuff. So how do you make that front and center in this? And then just minor little footnote on the screen. Forget all about that. So, and this has been just compounding and compounding and compounding with Marvel. With Disney, Marvel. And my soft reboot, I think, would at least like revitalize it and bring it back and make it more interesting, because it would bring us back to the core characters at the start of what would be the original Phase 2 we never got to see. And again, let you bring in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. people individually, and because it would be fun watching like Melinda and Fitz and Simmons and Skye showing up in these different, like some of them are over here in Fantastic Four, some of them are over here in X-Men, some of them are over here in Avengers, and then something bringing them all together. Because that would be just as much fun watching superheroes pulled together for an event. It would be just as entertaining, and probably in some ways some of your audience would be far more vested in wanting to see what pulls these original Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. people together and forms them, like even if temporarily forms a new sort of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. moment happening here in this main timeline. So lots of things to do. And I suspect Disney's just going to ride this thing until they can't get anything out of it, and then eventually just sell the division away. Who knows? So we'll see. I don't even know. I think Deadpool's the only Marvel movie we're getting in 2024. Everything else has been pushed back to 2025 and beyond at this point. So they do have time, and I don't know how the Deadpool movie is going to even be ready with that strike finally just finishing. But we'll see. I don't know. I think that probably about wraps it up for today. This was just kind of fun playing around with like looking at the timelines and doing how I would reboot it and stuff, and just playing around in story with working with what you have. Because again, the preference would just be to wipe it and redo it all. Restart it all over with a big bang reboot. Have the Doctor show up and reboot the universe for them. And that'll let them start over. But I like my idea of just soft rebooting by going back to the end of the first Avengers movie and seeing what happens to that original timeline Cap when he wakes up after having been knocked out by Endgame Cap, and then following them from there to see where their actual story goes. So anyway, hopefully you enjoyed this today. Let me know down in the comments if you're watching this later on the replay, or if you've watched this live and you think about this for a while. Come back and let me know in the comments whether anything I said made any kind of sense, sounded interesting, or what ideas you might have for how you'd reboot the MCU. Now, I don't know if there's going to be a part 3 next week. This might kind of just wrap up this little sort of two-parter thing. I don't know yet. I still have to watch those last couple of episodes of Secret Invasion, and that has been a chore to try to get through that thing. And then I have to watch season 2 of Loki, I'm looking forward to seeing where that goes. Haven't heard great things about it, but there's a lot of things that I liked about the first Loki movie, even though the plot didn't make any sense. And I didn't go down that road in this live stream because that's an entire conversation as well on its own. But I'm looking forward to seeing what they do there. And I still have to watch Guardians of the Galaxy 3, so I've got a bunch of Marvel stuff to catch up on. It's just, I was so just turned off by Love and Thunder and Quantumania. They were just so horrifically bad, and the first half of Secret Invasion was just so bad. Like, if that's actually how they took Maria Hill out, I just, again, how they do these unforced errors to themselves, it just doesn't make any sense to me whatsoever. Like, how do you take a badass character from the comics and the MCU and just have her turn her into like the stupidest chump and have her go out like a chump? It's just, what an insult to that character and to the actress too. She hasn't gotten a lot of opportunities to be this character, and for that to be how it ends is just, it took most of my interest in Secret Invasion away with the way they killed her at the end of that first episode. But I think that is it. We're coming up on the hour, and I'm trying to keep these to around an hour for now. The Wheel of Time ones, they went quite long. If you haven't watched any of those, and I have a whole live stream series about the reviewing each episode of season 2 of the Wheel of Time. And it's the first live stream is the first 3 episodes, and then the next, each one has its own live stream after that. And the whole thing's probably, it's 12, 15, 16 hours of me going through that series. A lot of good things in season 2, but the bad things were worse than the bad things in season 1, sadly. Anyway, before I go off on another tangent, I'm going to wrap it up here. Thank you to everyone who watched this live. Thank you to B&B Books and Jeremiah for commenting. I appreciate anyone who gives me any of their time, be it live or on replays. And then real close to 2,000 subscribers, so the whole YouTube like, subscribe stuff, all down there. It does really help the channel out. And I appreciate it. And I will see you, hopefully I'll have a video, like a regular sit-down, recorded, edited video up next week, where I'll probably touch base back on with where I'm at with Malazan. And I should see you next Sunday night, live streaming again, because I do want to have these as a regular Sunday night thing. And with that, I will bid you adieu. Have a good night. And like I do every single time, I never remember to bring the cursor, the mouse pointer, up to the end stream button. So I will do that now. Have a good night.